It was just after the storm when he saw it. Something floating down the river, barely visible, barely moving. Not wood, not debris. A dog, big, soaked, and silent, drifting like it had given up. He didn't think, he just ran. What came next wasn't rescue. It was the moment everything quietly changed. If you're drawn to stories where broken lives find each other and fight to heal, like this video, subscribe and stay. This journey's only just begun. It had rained hard the night before in Willow Bend, a quiet town nestled deep in the central valleys of Oregon, where pine trees leaned close over narrow roads, and the river always whispered something old. The Deschutes was swollen now, rushing brown and cold, dragging branches and silt from the mountains toward the lowland bend. Gray clouds still hung overhead like a ceiling that hadn't fully lifted, and the wind carried a damp chill that wrapped around Wyatt Miller as he stood at the edge of the bank, boots sinking slightly into the mud. Wyatt was 39, with a square jaw covered in 2-day stubble and thick brown hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck. He had once been a firefighter, the kind who ran into burning buildings before anyone else even smelled the smoke. But that was years ago, before the accident, before the loss. Now he lived alone in a weather-worn cabin by the river's edge, a mile from the nearest paved road, spending most of his days mending old tools, tending his vegetable garden, and avoiding people. He had broad shoulders that hunched slightly when he walked, like he was always bracing for bad news. The townsfolk still recognized him when he drove into town once a week, but few dared strike up conversation. Grief made a man quiet, and Wyatt's silence was the kind that built walls, not bridges. This morning, he had come out with the intent of clearing debris from the stretch of river behind his house. But when his eyes followed the racing current, something snagged his attention. A large, dark shape bobbing between the rocks. At first, he thought it was a log or a piece of storm-torn fence. But as it floated closer, Wyatt saw the faint glint of something taut and wet. Rope. And then movement. Just barely, the shape shifted. He dropped his gloves. The raft had caught on a cluster of partially submerged boulders, wedging it in place before it could be swept downstream. Wyatt's heart stuttered. His body moved before his mind caught up. Old instincts, not yet drowned. Boots hit water, splashing forward as he broke into a full stride. Within seconds, the current was past his knees, tugging hard. Wyatt gritted his teeth and pushed forward, grabbing hold of the jagged piece of wood that served as a makeshift raft, a lashed-together scrap of pallets and styrofoam, and on it, tied tightly with fraying rope around its torso and front legs, was a dog. The German Shepherd was enormous for its age, maybe 4 or 5 months old, but already as big as a medium-sized adult. His fur, thick and matted with river debris, was a deep black streaked with tan along the flanks and legs. His ears were flat, one nicked and torn, and his body trembled with exhaustion. His head, sagging, rested just above the waterline, thanks to the slant of the raft. His eyes, a stormy, unreadable amber, flicked up to Wyatt just once before he collapsed again. Wyatt cursed softly under his breath, sliced the rope with his belt knife, and hoisted the wet, heavy mass of the pup into his arms. "Hang on, buddy," he muttered. "I got you." The dog didn't resist. He was too far gone for that. But when Wyatt's arm wrapped around his ribcage, there was a faint twitch, a shudder at the warmth, a barely audible whimper, like some small part of him still longed for rescue. By the time Wyatt stumbled back to shore, lungs burning, hands scraped raw, the clouds had begun to scatter. Pale light filtered through the trees, catching on the silver glint of water dripping from the pup's fur. Wyatt laid him gently on the grass, pressing his hand to the dog's chest, slow but steady, still alive. He didn't speak for a long moment, just breathed beside the animal, letting his pulse slow. Then, rising with a groan, he gathered the limp body into his arms and started toward the cabin. From across the clearing, hidden behind the branches of a fir tree, a pair of small eyes watched with curiosity and concern. Ellie Lambert was 8 years old, and the closest thing Wyatt had to a neighbor. She lived a few houses down the road with her single mother and her cat, Clementine. Ellie was all elbows and wild brown curls, with a permanent smudge of graphite on her left thumb from drawing every chance she got. Her jeans were always a little too short, her boots always muddy, and her backpack always full of sketchbooks. Unlike most children her age, Ellie rarely talked unless she had something important to say. And right now, what she had seen felt very important. Something inside her stirred, not fear, not curiosity. Something like knowing. From her perch near the bend, she had been trying to sketch the swollen river after the storm, but when she saw Mr. Miller wade into the water and pull out that dog, that huge waterlogged creature, her pencil stopped mid-line. She watched, breath held, as the man carried the animal away, like something precious, not like something broken. Ellie wasn't sure what the story was yet, but she knew she wanted to draw it. Back in his cabin, Wyatt laid the dog on an old quilt near the fireplace. The hearth hadn't been lit in days, but he struck a match now, coaxing flame into warmth. He fetched a towel and a small bowl of water, setting them beside the animal, and sat down hard in his old armchair. The dog remained still, breath shallow. Wyatt frowned at the rope burns along its legs. Whoever did this hadn't meant for it to survive. Something tight twisted in his gut. He didn't give the dog a name yet. That would mean something more. He just called it Buddy when he spoke out loud, which wasn't often. Outside, the wind had settled and birds returned to the branches. But inside, time moved differently, slow and silent, like the moment just before a forest catches fire. Wyatt didn't know what to make of the feeling settling in his chest. It wasn't just anger, it was recognition. That night, as the sky dimmed to purple and the first stars blinked through the clouds, Wyatt sat watching the pup sleep. At one point, the dog's leg twitched. Maybe a dream, maybe memory. Wyatt reached forward, placed a hand lightly on the creature's back, and whispered, "You're all right now." From her window down the road, Ellie sketched the silhouette of the cabin chimney and the faint glow behind its curtains. She didn't know why, but something told her that the dog she'd seen rescued wasn't just any dog. Something had begun that day, not loud or sudden, but with a quiet choice in the middle of a fast river. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered. Willow Bend, with its quiet streets and dew-drenched rooftops, had returned to its usual rhythm. The river had receded just enough to reveal a new scattering of driftwood along the bank, like pieces of forgotten stories left behind. Inside the cabin at the bend, the fireplace crackled with a low, persistent warmth, its glow reaching the edges of the worn wooden floor. Atlas lay curled on a thick folded quilt near the fire, his breathing shallow but steadier than the day before. Wyatt sat nearby in the armchair, his arms crossed, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't named the dog yet, not out loud, but the name Atlas had formed in his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite shake. There was something about the weight that the pup carried in silence, the way he hadn't cried or barked once, even when being lifted from the cold current. It reminded Wyatt of something he had once understood well: endurance that looks like stillness. That night, just past midnight, Wyatt was awakened by a sound he couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the river or the wind. It was soft, broken, a choked, panicked yelp. He sat up quickly. Atlas was thrashing in his sleep, paws twitching violently, ribs heaving. His legs moved like he was swimming, no drowning. Each kick more desperate than the last. A whimper escaped his throat, raw and guttural. Wyatt dropped to the floor beside him. Hey, easy," he murmured, laying a hand gently across the pup's shoulder. Atlas didn't wake. His body tensed, then shuddered as if caught beneath another wave. Wyatt shifted closer and did something he hadn't done in years. He stayed. "I'm here," he whispered, not sure who the words were for. Atlas's body gradually relaxed under the steady weight of Wyatt's hand, though his tail remained curled tightly to his side. Wyatt didn't return to bed. He leaned against the hearth wall, eyes half shut, listening to the deep breaths of a creature that didn't yet know it was safe. By dawn, the dog was still asleep, but the tremors had returned. Wyatt stood and reached for a small notepad he kept near the kitchen window. Scribbling with the tip of a worn pencil, he jotted down times, behaviors, notes. Something in him had switched on, a need to understand, to anticipate. The same part of him that used to run emergency drills now studied the sleeping pattern of a dog he didn't yet call his own. Later that morning, as Wyatt stepped onto the porch to bring in a few logs, he noticed a slip of folded paper tucked beneath a stone near the edge of the steps. Curious, he picked it up. The paper was faintly damp, but still legible, pencil lines sketching a rough but surprisingly accurate outline of Atlas lying curled by the fire, complete with the shape of the scar under his left ear. At the bottom of the drawing were the words, "Hi, doggy." Wyatt glanced around but saw no one. He didn't smile, not exactly, but the corners of his mouth shifted slightly. He placed the drawing on the inside windowsill and went about his chores. Ellie Lambert had been dropping off drawings for 3 days now. Simple, earnest messages that said more than she ever would out loud. "You're a brave dog." The river didn't win. "I hope you have dreams about bones, not water." Each sketch was different. Sometimes Atlas standing tall like a knight, sometimes Wyatt in a cape, holding a leash. She never signed her name, but Wyatt knew it was her. Back at the cabin, Atlas stirred. He was still weak, rising only long enough to lap at water or sniff the bowl of softened food Wyatt had begun preparing with broth. But his eyes tracked movement now. He watched the door. He followed Wyatt's steps with slow turns of his head. Once, when Wyatt walked past too quickly, Atlas flinched just barely, but it was enough to send something sharp through Wyatt's chest. On the third night, the nightmares returned. This time, Atlas let out a low whine before kicking out his legs. Wyatt had been asleep in the armchair again, the blanket over his lap forgotten. He woke immediately, knelt beside the pup, and pulled him into his arms. Atlas whimpered, then froze, but didn't pull away. He was heavier now that he'd begun eating again, but he still felt fragile like a creature stitched together from storm and survival. That evening, Wyatt took out a small box from the top shelf of his closet. Inside were old keepsakes, a lighter with a firehouse emblem, a photograph of his daughter in a red raincoat, and a charred corner of a birthday card. He didn't open the card. Instead, he removed a small fleece dog blanket he had once bought on impulse, years ago. Back then, it had been for the idea of getting a dog for the little girl who never got one. He unfolded it now, shook off the dust, and laid it beside the fire. Atlas sniffed at the blanket, then looked at Wyatt, and for the first time, without coaxing, he limped slowly toward it and lay down. His breathing slowed almost instantly. Out on the edge of the property, Ellie crouched behind a bush, sketchbook hugged to her knees. She'd seen the whole thing through the window Atlas's slow steps, Wyatt's quiet offering. She smiled and began drawing again, this time adding a small campfire and 3 figures around it. One tall, one 4-legged, and one with curls. The late autumn sun filtered softly through the trees, casting long golden shadows over the clearing outside Wyatt's cabin. The breeze was gentler now, rustling the pine needles with a hush that felt more like breath than sound. It had been 6 days since Atlas had been pulled from the river, and though his wounds were healing and his body gaining strength, his spirit still hovered somewhere between retreat and trust. But something had shifted, just a little like the subtle lean of branches before they bend. That morning, as Wyatt chopped kindling behind the cabin, he heard it, a soft knock at the front door, not hurried, not timid, just patient. He wiped his hands on a rag, brow furrowing slightly as he moved to the entrance. When he opened the door, Ellie Lambert stood there, one foot slightly behind the other, arms wrapped around a folded paper. She looked smaller on the porch than she did in the woods, almost fragile under her thick knit sweater, with a faded owl stitched across the chest. Her curly brown hair was pulled into a messy side braid, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold walk. She blinked up at Wyatt, not with fear, but something closer to resolve. "I brought this," she said, and held out the paper. Wyatt took it slowly. It was another drawing this time, a close-up of Atlas, eyes closed, chin resting on a paw. The shading was careful, deliberate, full of quiet attention. He glanced at the girl, unsure what to say. "He looks sad when he sleeps," Ellie added, her voice soft. "But I think maybe he remembers someone being kind." Wyatt studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "He's resting by the fire," he said. "You can say hi, if you'd like." Ellie's eyes lit up, but she didn't run in. She walked carefully, boots tapping softly on the wooden floor as she entered. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Atlas lay on his blanket, his head turned toward the fire, ears twitching slightly. Wyatt watched from the doorway as Ellie knelt slowly near him, sitting cross-legged a few feet away. She said nothing at first, just let her sketchbook slide open across her knees. She began to draw in silence, as if the sound of pencils could speak more than her voice. Atlas shifted, lifting his head. His eyes opened halfway and landed on her. It was their first true moment, dog and girl. Ellie paused midline, and Atlas didn't flinch. He looked at her the way a soul looks through smoke, curious, cautious, but not afraid. She smiled gently, setting the pencil down. "Hi, doggy," she whispered. Atlas blinked slowly. Then, in a motion so small Wyatt almost missed it, the pup stretched his neck forward and nudged her hand with his nose. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Wyatt felt something catch in his chest. Ellie looked up at him with wide eyes. "He likes company," she said, almost surprised. Wyatt nodded once. "Seems that way." They stayed like that for nearly an hour. Ellie drew quietly while Atlas lay half dozing beside her. When it was time for her to leave, she stood, dusted off her jeans, and turned to Wyatt. "My mom says I can come by after school sometimes, if that's okay." Wyatt hesitated, then gave a short nod. "So long as your mom knows where you are." Ellie grinned and bounded down the porch steps. As she disappeared into the trees, Wyatt noticed something else. A drawing had slipped from her sketchbook and landed on the hallway floor. He picked it up. This one showed 3 figures by a campfire: a tall man, a large dog, and a little girl with curls. All 3 were smiling. That night, Wyatt found himself restless. After washing dishes in the dim kitchen light, he wandered to the old storage shed behind the house. The padlock clicked open with a familiar rattle. Inside, the scent of old cedar and rusted tools lingered. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight. He hadn't been in here in months. He reached for a box high on the shelf labeled Kayla. It was his daughter's name. The box held what little he had saved: an old backpack with cartoon suns on it, a well-worn blanket, and at the very bottom, a pair of muddy pink sneakers with the soles starting to crack. Wyatt sat on an overturned bucket and held the shoes for a long time. Through the thin wooden wall, he could hear Atlas shifting near the fireplace, his collar tag tapping softly against the floor. Wyatt looked down at the shoes, then toward the sound. The way Atlas slept, curled in tight, muzzle resting near his back paws. It was painfully familiar. It was how Kayla used to sleep on long road trips, head pressed against his side, hand clutching his coat. A memory rose, sudden and sharp. Kayla giggling as she put her stuffed bear on a leash, saying, "Now you know how it feels, Daddy." Wyatt pressed the shoes gently back into the box, closed the lid, and this time locked it again. He stood outside the shed for a while, the cold settling in. Above him, the stars had begun to pepper the sky, flickering like forgotten conversations. Back inside, Atlas was awake, lifting his head slightly as Wyatt returned. "You remember too much," Wyatt said quietly, sitting down beside him. Atlas shifted closer, and then, without hesitation, he did something he hadn't done before. He licked Wyatt's hand. Just once. A soft, warm gesture. A choice. The weather turned quickly in Willow Bend, the way it often did in early November, without warning and without apology. That afternoon had started crisp and bright, the sky clear as glass, with golden leaves fluttering from the trees like confetti. Ellie had come over after school, her sketchbook wedged beneath her arm, and a plastic bag of oatmeal cookies bouncing at her side. Wyatt had just finished stacking firewood near the porch when he heard her soft humming approaching. Atlas, who had taken to resting by the front steps in the waning daylight, lifted his head as she came closer. He still didn't bark, but his tail thumped twice against the planks, an acknowledgement. Wyatt noticed and gave a quiet grunt of approval, though he said nothing as Ellie sat down beside the dog, offering him a cookie. He sniffed it politely, then laid his head on her knee. The moment was peaceful, fragile like early frost. And then, from the west, thunder cracked across the sky like a whip. Atlas jerked upright. His entire body stiffened, eyes wide, ears pinned. Another rumble followed, low and long. In the distance, the trees swayed unnaturally as wind swept in with a howl, rattling the windows of the cabin. Rain began in fits, first a few fat drops, then a torrent. "Whoa," Ellie murmured, shielding her sketchbook with her sweater. But Atlas wasn't focused on the rain. His gaze locked on the trees near the river. Then, without warning, he bolted off the porch. "Atlas!" Wyatt's voice thundered nearly as loud as the sky, but it was too late. The dog sprinted across the yard and down the slope toward the riverbank, paws pounding the wet ground with reckless urgency. Ellie stood, frozen for a second, then gave chase without thinking. "Ellie, wait!" Wyatt started, but she was already gone. The storm thickened, blinding. Rain lashed sideways, and the air was sharp with static. Wyatt stumbled from the porch, grabbing his jacket from a hook as he ran after them. Down by the water, the scene unraveled in heartbeats. The river had risen again, its edges foaming and wild. Atlas had stopped near the rocks, body taut, eyes wild. His breathing was rapid, chest heaving like he was back in that terrible dream tide to wood, swept toward nothingness. Ellie, panting, reached him just as her foot slipped on the mossy stone. Her arms flailed, and she pitched sideways toward the edge of a slick rock shelf. But in one swift, unthinking motion, Atlas leapt forward, planted himself squarely between her and the fall, and braced. Ellie tumbled into his side instead of the water. She landed hard but safe, her arms wrapping instinctively around the dog's thick neck. Atlas didn't move. He just stood there, solid and unmoving, soaked to the bone but steady as stone. Wyatt arrived seconds later, breathless, mud on his boots and rain plastering his hair to his forehead. His eyes scanned the two figures by the river girl and dog clinging together in the middle of the downpour. His hands shook. He dropped to his knees beside them, arms going around both. Ellie was trembling, wet curls stuck to her cheeks, her small hands still clutching Atlas's fur. "He caught me," she whispered. "I slipped, but he caught me." Wyatt looked at Atlas. The dog's eyes were different now, not panicked, not wild. They were focused, alert, protective. Back at the cabin, Wyatt lit a fire so hot it made the walls sweat. He wrapped Ellie in a thick wool blanket and handed her a mug of warm milk, which she took without a word. Atlas lay nearby, still wet, but no longer trembling. "You all right?" Wyatt asked, crouching beside Ellie. She nodded. "I've seen storms before, but not like that." Wyatt hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Your mom know you're out in this?" Ellie looked down. "She works late, Tuesdays and Thursdays. She thinks I'm with my friend Jasmine." Wyatt didn't push. He stood and fetched a towel, then sat beside Atlas and began to dry him gently. The dog didn't flinch. He leaned slightly into Wyatt's touch. Outside, the storm had slowed to a steady drizzle. The worst had passed. Later that evening, after Ellie had fallen asleep, curled in a patchwork quilt on the old couch, Wyatt stood in the doorway, staring at the quiet cabin interior. Atlas lay near the fireplace again, eyes closed, tail flicking once with each crackle of the logs. Wyatt's hands rested on the frame of the door. For years, this space had been silent. Now, it carried the rhythm of new, breath-soft, hesitant, but real. And for the first time in a long while, he left the door unlocked. The Willow Bend Art Festival came every November, a weekend affair that turned the sleepy riverside town into a maze of bunting, easels, and cinnamon stands. This year, the gathering felt livelier than usual. The town green was dotted with makeshift tents, each draped in colorful fabric flapping in the breeze. Families wandered with hot cider in hand, and the air was sweet with roasted pecans and wet leaves. But beneath the festivities, a quiet current of anticipation flowed, especially near the children's art tent, where a small easel stood, displaying a portrait that had already drawn murmurs. The piece was titled "The Dog from the River," done in pencil and charcoal. It showed a large German shepherd, curled on a broken raft, eyes wide and haunted. The storm in the background had been sketched with sharp lines and blurred shading, making the dog's stillness feel louder. Beneath the image was a single line of text, written in Ellie Lambert's careful, uneven cursive. "Sometimes heroes don't roar. Sometimes they just hold on." Ellie, standing nearby in a navy peacoat a size too big, tugged at the sleeves nervously. Her curls had been brushed, though a few still sprung rebelliously toward her forehead. She clutched her sketchbook tightly to her chest, glancing now and then toward the crowd. Most people moved on quickly, smiling politely. But a few stopped longer. One older man adjusted his glasses, stared at the piece, and murmured, "Is that the Miller dog?" Wyatt stood not far behind, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. He wore a faded flannel shirt beneath a brown work jacket, sleeves rolled just enough to show the burn scars along his forearms. He'd come only because Ellie had insisted. "It's not just my art," she had said. "It's his story, too." Atlas lay at Wyatt's feet, leash slack, gaze following the festival slowly like a sentinel. He wore no vest, no badge, just a blue collar Wyatt had picked up at the general store, plain except for a single silver tag etched with his name. As people gathered, the murmurs grew. "He's the one from the rescue, isn't he? Wasn't he in the river during the storm? I heard he saved that little girl from falling." The local deputy, Matt Fenwick, arrived just after noon. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with a round, sun-flushed face and a permanent squint that made him look more skeptical than he was. Matt had grown up in Willowbend, and while he wasn't the sharpest in the department, he was loyal, honest, and kept a thermos of black coffee glued to his hand year-round. He bent to scratch Atlas behind the ears, something few dared to do without asking. Atlas leaned in slightly, a rare public gesture of trust. "You're getting famous, big guy," Matt said, then looked up at Wyatt. "Mind if I share something with the folks? I think it's time." Wyatt gave a slow nod. Matt turned toward the small crowd that had gathered around the portrait. "Some of you've asked about this dog. His name's Atlas. He wasn't just pulled from the river. He was dumped there, tied to a raft with no way to get free. A miracle he was found in time." The murmuring hushed. "But what most of you don't know," he continued, "is that Atlas wasn't just abandoned. He came from a compound across county lines, an illegal training ring for combat dogs. The sheriff's department raided it 2 weeks ago. Atlas wasn't the only one, but he's the only one we know of that made it this far." Gasps rippled through the group. Ellie's hands clenched around her sketchbook. Wyatt shifted slightly but didn't move. He was holding something in his jacket pocket, a small manila envelope, creased at the corners. Inside was a completed adoption application, signed and initialed, but not yet turned in. Matt went on. "They used high-frequency whistles, shock collars, tethering harnesses. These dogs weren't trained to love. They were trained to obey or break. Most of them didn't make it. Just then, a tall man near the back, likely unaware of the weight of his action, let out a sharp whistle, the kind used to call a pet. Atlas's entire body froze. It happened fast. The moment the sound hit his ears, Atlas dropped to the ground, belly flat, tail between his legs. He began trembling violently, ears pinned, pupils blown wide. His breathing shortened. He whimpered, low and broken. Ellie gasped. "No, no, no, it's okay." She rushed forward, crouching beside him, whispering, "It's not that place. It's not that anymore." Wyatt knelt as well, heart hammering. He reached slowly and pulled Atlas toward him, cradling the shaking dog in his arms. As he did, the collar shifted, revealing a thin scar circling the neck, uneven, raised, and angry. A rope burn, years deep. No one spoke for several seconds. Matt turned toward the man who had whistled. "Sir, I'm going to ask you not to do that again." The man stammered an apology and backed away. Atlas began to calm, the tremors fading under Wyatt's steady hands. Ellie's small palm rested lightly on the dog's paw, anchoring him. The crowd slowly dispersed, quieter now, not out of discomfort, but reverence. That evening, back at the cabin, Wyatt stood before the small mirror in his bedroom. His reflection looked tired, worn, but not empty. He held the adoption papers in his hand. The line for signature was the last untouched space. He looked at it. He thought about the river, about the girl sleeping in the next room, and the dog curled at the hearth, twitching in sleep but no longer whimpering. He thought about love, not the kind that clung to the past, but the kind brave enough to risk again. He signed. The first snow came early that year, soft and dry, dusting the roofs of Willowbend like powdered sugar and turning the pine branches white at their tips. It wasn't enough to stick for long, but enough to remind the town that winter was near, and with it, a quiet kind of stillness. At the edge of the Deschutes River, Wyatt's cabin stood solid against the trees, chimney breathing slow curls of smoke into the pale morning air. Inside, the fire burned low, and the room carried the scent of pine sap and old wool. Atlas had taken to sleeping beside the front door, not out of anxiety, but instinct. He liked knowing who came and went, even if the only visitor lately was Ellie. He had grown fuller muscles filled in beneath the once loose fur, and the shadow behind his eyes had softened. He no longer flinched at creaking hinges or sudden movement, and though the nightmares still came, they left quicker now, often chased away by Wyatt's hand, resting gently on his shoulder in the dark. Wyatt was different too. Since submitting the adoption forms, something inside him had untangled, not all at once but gradually, like a knot soaked in warm water. He still spoke little, still kept to himself in town, but he moved more, thought less, smiled sometimes. And when he looked at Atlas, it wasn't with the cautious tenderness of someone afraid to lose again, but with the quiet confidence of someone willing to stay. It was Ellie who first suggested the idea. "You know," she said one afternoon, as they sat under the porch awning, watching Atlas sniff around the edge of the woods, "he'd be really good at finding people." Wyatt raised a brow. "You mean rescue?" Ellie nodded. "He always knows where I am. Even when I hide behind the tool shed, he finds me before you do." Wyatt chuckled under his breath. "Maybe I'm just slow." That week, Wyatt called the Willow Bend Search and Rescue Outpost. It wasn't big, just a volunteer team of 12 led by a woman named Lauren Redding, who had shoulders like a lumberjack and a gaze that could strip paint. Lauren was in her early 50s with gray-streaked auburn hair pulled into a permanent braid and an old Labrador named Diesel, who limped beside her like a war veteran. She met Wyatt and Atlas behind the fire station on a cloudy Tuesday morning. "German Shepherd, huh?" she said, sizing Atlas up. "He looks strong." "He's smart," Wyatt replied. "And steady." Lauren gave him a hard look. "You sure he's ready for this?" Wyatt looked down at Atlas, who sat calmly at his side, watching Diesel with quiet curiosity. "He is, and so am I." Training began that weekend. At first it was all scent games, hide and seek, with gloves and socks soaked in essential oil. Ellie, of course, volunteered to be the first lost person, giggling from behind the old woodshed, as Atlas sniffed her out in under 45 seconds. Then came obstacle drills, mock searches in the forest, and voice command consistency. Wyatt worked with him daily, following Lauren's regimented schedule, and the results came quick. Atlas took to it like he'd been waiting his whole life for this kind of structure, not fear-based, not obedience out of pain, but purpose. One afternoon, while practicing directional cues near the ridge trail, Wyatt found himself alone with Lauren. "You've got a history with this dog," she said without turning. "I pulled him out of the river," he replied simply. Lauren nodded. "And he pulled you out of something too, I bet." Wyatt didn't answer. He didn't need to. By early December, Atlas passed the basic readiness check. Lauren called it provisional status, but handed over the red rescue vest anyway. Ellie helped stitch a patch onto it with her mother's sewing kit. The words read, "Search Team, Willow Bend, S.A.R." Beneath it, in smaller thread, she embroidered a tiny sketch of 3 figures beside a river. The ceremony was small, held at the riverside clearing behind Wyatt's cabin. Just a few volunteers, Ellie's mom, Sophie, a kind-faced woman in her late 30s with streaks of tiredness beneath her eyes, and Lauren's team. Ellie insisted on giving a speech, clutching a note card and reading with trembling hands. "I drew Atlas because he was brave, but then I realized he wasn't just brave for surviving. He was brave for trusting again. And so was Mr. Wyatt. And I think bravery is just love that keeps going." When she finished, Atlas trotted over and nudged her hand. She dropped the note card and laughed, the sound echoing against the trees. After the clapping faded, Wyatt knelt beside his dog. He ran a hand through the thick fur behind Atlas's ears, then leaned close and whispered, "You weren't just rescued, buddy. You rescued me, too." Later that evening, the sky turned the color of smoldering coals as Wyatt stoked the fire one last time. Ellie was curled up on the rug, sketchbook open in her lap. She was working on something new. When she was done, she handed it to Wyatt without a word. The drawing showed 3 figures standing side by side at the edge of the river. Wyatt, tall and solid, Atlas, upright and alert, and Ellie, her curls blowing sideways in a wind you could almost feel. The river behind them wasn't wild or menacing anymore. It flowed calmly, a ribbon of silver weaving gently between rocks. At the bottom, she'd written, 3 hearts, 1 current, still moving forward. Wyatt placed the drawing on the mantel above the fire. Sometimes God's miracles don't come with thunder. They come quietly, in second chances, in trust rebuilt, in hearts learning to love again. Atlas didn't just survive. He reminded us that healing is holy work. If this story moved you, please share it. Leave a comment below, and if you believe in the quiet power of grace, type Amen. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and may God bless you and those you love.